The Fully Mindful podcast explores what it is to be fully mindful and present in our everyday lives, uncover our worth, and discover our purposes. I'm Melissa Chareau, the host of The Fully Mindful. I'm a neurodivergent lawyer, mindfulness teacher, and embodiment and breathwork coach. On The Fully Mindful, I interview inspiring creatives, wellness leaders, and social disruptors about how they have discovered their purpose or purposes and live a mindful and connected life. Every other episode, I also offer mindfulness and somatic practices that work for everyday people doing everyday things so that we can thrive and be present for the people and causes we care the most about. Find me at The Fully Mindful on all the places that you listen to your podcasts.
We only bring a portion of who we are to a lifetime. So the rest of me is always back home or your higher self.
Today's guest, again, is Richard Martini, an award-winning American film director, producer, screenwriter, and freelance journalist. Rich has made quite a name for himself in researching the afterlife, or what he refers to as the flip side. Just Google him and gain access to any of his many books and documentaries on the flip side, or tune in, as I do, to an episode of his podcast, Hacking the Afterlife with Jennifer Schaefer. Today we will be talking about his latest book, The Greatest Story Never Told, as told by Jesus and those who knew him. I listened to his book on Audible and cannot endorse it more highly to those who are both of these things, both curious and open-minded, as I consider these two necessary prerequisites for this book. What is revealed is so enthralling and captivating, and as Rich would say, mind-bending. Today we're going to start at the beginning, both for Richard and the book, and yes, for Jesus. The introduction is called Flecks of Gold, so that's where we will start, and then we will be diving into chapter 1, called The Breath of Cows, which is an account of Jesus' birth from someone speaking to his mother, Mary. There's that book. It's so great to have you back, Richard, once again.
Thank you so much. And I just got this in the mail today. You know, they sent me a proof before, and I got to say, this is a pretty one. I'm enjoying it.
Yes.
I had them make it a cream interior, so it kind of reads easier. It's easier on the eyes. Anyway, for those who read, not many people read these days. So, Flecks of Gold. It's a great question, and it reminds me of that Sting song, Fields of Gold. Mm-hmm. Beautiful song. And so how it came about was, and really sort of rolling back to why Jesus? What's he doing here?
Exactly.
And it really started with the story was a friend of mine had lost her mother recently and was very sort of beyond herself with grief. And I ran into her in the street. She was just sobbing. And I said, I think maybe hypnotherapy might help you. And she was like, well, what are you talking about? What's that? And I said, well, I've been filming people. At that point, I think I'd filmed about a dozen people who had, in fact, the first book, Flipside, was finished, but because of what happened with her, I squeezed that into the book. But basically, I said, what people do is they talk to a hypnotherapist who then walks them, and sometimes they see loved ones who passed away. So I thought, why not? Let's try it. So she was like, I have to do this tomorrow. So Scott DeTamble, lightbetweenlives.com, hypnotherapist, trained by Michael Newton, came out to Santa Monica. But the night before, we were on the phone talking about about Flipside, the research. And it just popped into my head how the president of the Newton Institute at the time, Paul Orend, when I did his interview, I said, because he had done a very dramatic thing, and it's in the movie and the book Flipside, where a woman recalls expiring in Auschwitz. And it's very dramatic and very hard to sort of wrap one's mind around. And so I'm interviewing this hypnotherapist. He'd been for many years, and here he was president of the Newton Institute. And I said, so do you get a lot of people from who remember a lifetime where they died in the Holocaust? Just a, maybe there's something connected there. He said, no, actually I get a lot of people who remember Jesus. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, they remember a lifetime with him, or they remember a lifetime where he was profoundly influential in their journey. And instantly I thought, jaded Hollywood guy that I am, I said, well, has anybody described him? What does he look like? Because, that's always been a bugaboo, what color is his skin and what did he look like? And he laughed and said, it never came up. I never asked. And subsequently, I just saw this factoid the other day, which is that in near-death experiences, a study done by Dr. Emily Kelly, University of Virginia, of, I think it was like 2,000 near-death experiences, 11% of people who saw someone on the other side during their near-death event saw Jesus. So, just as a data set, what are these people seeing? That's the question.
Right.
So Scott and I were on the telephone. We're just talking about how weird that was. So the next day, my friend does this hypnotherapy session. She quickly sees her mother, has a conversation with her. Mother says new information to her, stuff that could only come from her mother. Helped her. And at some point, Scott was saying, well, let's go to a previous lifetime that has some significance to this one. And she's, as the process is, they go back in time. Where are we? What do you see yourself? She saw herself as a young girl, like a gypsy, living in Jerusalem, and the year was 18. Now, Scott said 18 something or something 18. And she said, I'm just getting the number 18 when you ask me when. And I'm like, 18 in Jerusalem? So I quickly grab my, piece of 3x5 Post-it. And I say, ask her if she's ever seen Jesus. And of course, hypnotherapists don't really work that way. He looks at the note, and then about 20 minutes later, he slips in, so did you ever go outside and see people speak? And she froze, and tears started coming out of her eyes, and her face turned beet red, and she said, I'm standing 10 feet away from Jesus. And, as a observer, I'm just filming. And Scott then goes and asks the question, what's he talking about? He's talking about love, unconditional love. And she says, there's just something radiating from him. It's so powerful. I can't breathe, but it's just unconditional love. I can feel it. And so I'm writing another note. Ask what he looks like. And so she then goes into this very detailed description of the color of his skin, which was sort of a mix between European and of the region, a mix, that his hair was a certain length. He didn't have a beard at this point when she's seeing him. I mean, other people say he does. But then the question was, what do his eyes look like? What color are his eyes? And she said, they're brown. They're like a deep, rich brown. But there's a weird color inside of them. And it's like there are flecks of gold. It's a very odd detail and very specific. And so then, and so look, as anybody observing something very unusual, mind-bending, you just have to set it aside. Like, okay, this person saw this person, and maybe somebody else will see something else. We don't know. But that started this sort of journey, and that was about 2008 or 9. And over the next 10, 15 years that it's been, he shows up quite often. And with people who are skeptics, with people who are atheists, with people who are of other religions. He doesn't show up by himself often. It's usually when there's a group of people, like a council. My last book, Divine Councils in the Afterlife, sometimes people will say, I'm looking at my council and there's Jesus. And of course, I always ask, how do you know it's Jesus? Is he wearing a name tag?
Exactly.
It's a simple question.
Yeah.
And they just go, no, I know it's him. I have And then I'll ask, did you know him in his lifetime as Jesus? Sometimes they say, no, I only know him from here. Sometimes they say, yeah, he was there. And then I ask them details about their journey. And somewhere along the line, the former president of Paramount Pictures, David Kirkpatrick, reached out to me and said, I think you should write a book about these accounts, but put them in chronological order. From the beginning, the first people who claimed, the different people that I'm speaking to were talking about knowing him at different times in his life. One was early, one was his middle years, a couple were in the middle years. Some were people who had met him on his path. Some people met him when he was traveling and preaching. And then quite a few, and I can only tell you that they come from all over the planet. They knock on my door. I get a call from a fella from India, and he's visiting relatives here, and he says, I've read your book, and I need to talk to you. I know that you mentioned that some people have seen Jesus. Okay. So we go and have coffee, and he weaves this incredible story of sort of constantly having these dreams about those events, and then doing a hypnotherapy session and being very specific about a memory of who he was. And he's a very successful real estate guy in India, and he's very prone to giving details in a very specific way. He also writes for the Times of India, as a journalist. And so every detail that he gave me, I was able to sort of identify, let's say, the names. Yeah. Still, that doesn't mean that somebody was that person. It only becomes very unusual when somebody else says, I saw you there. A wonderful example is Dr. Brian Weiss, the author of Many Lives, Many Masters. He's done a number of books. He's had 4,000 cases. Former Yale psychiatrist. Not
Skeptic.
Former, it's his background.
Yeah.
And he's a wonderful writer, but this thing jumped out at me in his, I mentioned it in the book, jumped out at me in his, I think it was his third book. He was doing a session with a client, and the client's remembering being at the time of Jesus and being on the Via Dolorosa, watching Jesus walk up, ostensibly to his crucifixion.
Yeah.
But the client says suddenly, and you were there, Dr. Weiss. I'm seeing you. You're standing with this wardrobe on, toga, with orange piping. I think that was the exact piping, unusual detail. And Dr. Weiss said, I had never told anybody that I had had a past life regression. And during that regression, I felt like I knew Jesus, almost like a colleague, because he said he had him over to his house. He was like a wealthy teacher or something. And he had Jesus over to his house, and they had long conversations about the nature of reality, about life, et cetera, et cetera. And he never told anybody this detail, but he did recall the orange piping of the toga that he used to wear. And so he mentions that. And so, it's a different level of evidentiary kind of reality when somebody says the same thing.
Right.
And so then I started using the flecks of gold as a paradigm when I'd ask somebody, you're seeing Jesus, to describe his eyes. And sometimes they'd go, I've had a few people say, oh, they're blue. I go, okay. Now go really close. And then they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, they're brown. And then, is there any other color in there? I'm seeing streaks of golden light. Gold. And sometimes they use the word flecks. I've never used flecks in a sentence.
Yeah. Well, let me slow this down, because I'm fully tracking with you, because I've read your books and watched your documentaries and listened to you frequently. Some of our listeners, I'm sure, have listened to every episode you've been on, so they're tracking as well. But for those who may be tuning in for the first time, just to clarify, your research is filming people who are under hypnosis. And when you refer to the Newton Institute, it is Michael Newton, who took people not just to past lives, but to lives between lives in addition to that. right? And as well, for this book, you also interview mediums, psychic mediums as well, who are also sharing information where you're like, the same themes, same words, same messages, the orange piping, these things that are like, that would be incredibly bizarre for that to be a coincidence. And what I love that you're saying is like, I'm not proselytizing. I'm not saying you must believe this. Here simply is the research.
This is what people are saying.
Yeah.
And so, yes, and thank you for clarifying that. So I started with the hypnotherapy methodology mainly because, as we've spoken in other podcasts, my friend passed away in my arms and then started visiting me. But before she died, she talked about being in a classroom in another universe where everyone was speaking about spirituality, and somehow they were speaking a language she'd never heard before, but somehow she totally understood it. Mm-hmm. And then some years later, I stumbled upon Michael Newton's book, Journey of Souls, where there was an account identical to what she said. And I thought, well, this is interesting. Maybe I should make a documentary about this guy. Yeah. Partially to show that it wasn't accurate, or was. I had no opinion. It either was or it wasn't. And the camera, I know the camera shows a lot, When somebody says, oh, no, you can't film that, you know that there's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. So I started with that, and Paul Orend, who I mentioned a minute ago, I was surprised when he said, yeah, bring your cameras in. We're doing a workshop, a teaching workshop in Chicago, and you're welcome. Didn't tell me what to shoot. He just asked for a copy, once I was done. Knowing full well that I would be as startled as I would be. And I went there with a kind of, I don't know, what's going on? Are they leading people? Like, what's happening? So I filmed 12 people under what, they call, it's deep hypnosis, but it doesn't matter. I also found that Dr. Wamba, I'm researching this, so turns out that Dr. Wamba, clinical psychologist from the University of the JFK University, she was doing studies 10 years before Michael Newton and having the identical results. Yeah. Accessing people about, I don't recall her in her data, her talking about specific avatars. She might have characterized them as people seeing avatars. And then, so the thing about data, in order to become data, has to be consistent and reproducible. So that would mean that if a person is having a near-death experience, and what they describe should, on many levels, at least the same hallmarks of somebody under hypnosis, accessing a previous lifetime or events, or back home, or the back between home. Lives realm, let's call it that. Uh-huh. It's interesting. That is a term that Michael Newton coined, and it implies that that's a different life than our life. But what I've learned from, and it's in his research, which is people report we're conscious and aware and exist prior to any incarnation, that we plan our lifetimes with the help of teachers and guides and council members, and we only bring a portion of who we are to a lifetime. So the rest of me is always back home or your higher self. So it's not that that's a between life thing. It's always existing. That's a good distinction. The on-stage things are the lives that kind of, curtain comes down, not so great. Let's try that again. Yes. Etc.
I really appreciate that distinction.
But going back to your point, which is that, so now I'm using hypnotherapy, and then we were talking about on the podcast yesterday, medium approached me out of the blue and said, I'm a big fan of your work. And I was like, okay, psychic? Is that what you're doing? It's not my cup of tea because I'm aware that the future doesn't exist yet. There's likely outcomes. And people on the other side have a good viewpoint. But this idea of predicting always was a problem for me to wrap my mind around. And so I was putting her off, basically saying, yeah, that's great, not my cup of tea. Yeah. And then I realized I was resisting listening to what she was saying. And I just said, well, what is it you do? And she said, well, I work with law enforcement on a daily basis to help them with, cases. And I thought, okay, well, that's something. That's evidentiary. Well, why don't we have a meeting? And so I took my camera down to Jennifer Schaefer's office, and we had and it's in the book, Hacking the Afterlife, where we had a wide-ranging discussion, not only with friends of mine who had passed away, Bill Paxton, but also a topic that I had been researching for 30 years, Amelia Earhart. And then at some point within this conversation, she stopped breathing, cheeks turned bright red, started crying, and said, Jesus is here. Now, I'm over on my, I'm across the room and my camera looking around. Really? Like, I don't really see him. Okay, what are you seeing? And then the question is, is he wearing a name tag? And then I actually made a point of challenging this reality. Not challenging him. That's not fair. But it is a challenge. And my challenge was, can I ask him a question? Directly, one-to-one. And she said, he says yes. Okay, the door has opened. And I said, can I ask you, why is it that everyone I filmed, and by that point I had 3 people who claimed to have seen him, all of them had the same reaction. Couldn't breathe, cheeks turned red, eyes crying, gasping for breath. Yeah. I said, why are you doing that? What's the matter with you?
What's the matter with you?
Why are you making these people sick? It's a challenge. And the idea is I'm challenging the person who's saying it to see if they're going to defend it on a religious basis.
Yeah.
He's the Prince of Peace or something.
Sure.
I don't know. I just thought, well, let's just see what he says. And his answer was, I brought more of source to this lifetime. And that's why when people are near me, they feel that unconditional love. And that's the reaction they have. Unconditional love is overwhelming.
Yeah.
I thought, wow, what a brilliant answer. And then I said, not so much with the Romans. And Jennifer said, he's laughing. I don't understand what you just asked or just you said, but he's laughing. And I thought, okay, this is really mind-bending.
Well, I love that she didn't get it. I love that she didn't get it.
She didn't get it. He did.
Yeah.
He thought that was funny. Yeah. Because if you're walking around with all this unconditional love, why would anybody beat the guy up?
Exactly. No, I get it, but I love that she didn't get it, because to me that's a distinction.
And for me, it's new information. This is a persona, clearly, somebody who has a sense of humor. And since then, and so I've talked with him. Again, I'm not seeing him. I don't hear him, but I'm talking to people who are seeing him.
Yeah.
And he is always making fun of me, or always has something. The last time I spoke to him, it's weird to say, the last time I spoke to somebody who said they were seeing him, I always ask them this question, usually, because they're kind of overawed. How could you not be? They're seeing him. Very strange. And I say, could you ask him to change into something that's more conducive to a conversation? And they go, it's so weird. As you started to say that, he just changed into jeans and a T-shirt. But he always changes into jeans and a T-shirt.
Well, yeah, so that's something that, if I'm a skeptic and I say to any person I see on the street, and I say, imagine someone in something casual. What are they wearing? They would probably say jeans and a T-shirt.
Some could. I agree with you. Uh-huh. But in this last case, I said, look at the T-shirt. Does it say anything on it?
Uh-huh.
Now, it could. Sometimes I go, no, it's blank. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I go, it's white.
Uh-huh.
Then sometimes he's wearing shoes. Sometimes not. Sandals, not.
Yeah.
This last time, she said, oh, there is something on it. It's the Grateful Dead. Now, if you're looking for a metaphor for somebody talking to you on the flip side, I mean, look, it could be that their subconscious really was just waiting to have that joke pop onto me. But all I can say is, here's the thing. He says these things. So people say consistently, eyes that are brown with flecks of gold. Yes. They also say, because I ask, why are you telling this? Why are you telling us an alternate story of your lifetime? Because he doesn't, we'll get into that, but he doesn't follow what the book says happened.
That's where I want to go.
And he says, Richard, it's not alternate if it's true. And so he's consistently said that sentence.
Yeah.
Which is not something I've ever heard any human being ever say.
Exactly.
And so it's a weirdly, deeply philosophical point. It's not an alternate story if it's accurate, if it's true, or if there's elements of truth.
Yeah. Okay, so flecks of gold. So all these consistencies around the eyes, if you really look closely, they turn from blue to brown and then streaks or flecks of gold.
And sometimes, I must admit, not that I have to admit it, but sometimes people will say they're like hazel, like my eyes are, with streaks of gold. So green in there, you see? So, and maybe even a blue-gray with flecks of gold. It's the gold part that seems to be the tag that he... Bless you.
Thank you.
And nobody sagdas et cum spiritu tuo for that sneeze.
Well, that's in a way, we're not going to go there, but your Catholic background too is really fascinating. Yes.
I was an altar boy.
Right. So you have strayed a bit, one might say.
Well, now that's I could debate that, which is I used to think I knew that where the communion was kept in the priest's inner sanctum, there was a tabernacle, as they call it, and you open it up, and that's where the consecrated hosts are. Mind you, they're pieces of bread that have been blessed. But to a young kid, it's like, that's Jesus.
Yeah.
They've been blessed, so that means they are the body of Jesus.
The body of Christ, yeah.
When they used to say that, I'd think to myself, is there like a little miniature Jesus inside the tabernacle?
Yeah.
Like watching TV, like got the remote. If you open it up, and I always thought that would be a good movie.
It would be a good movie.
Open up the tabernacle, and he's like, hello, I'm watching TV here.
Yeah, like Lily Tomlin, the Incredible Shrinking Woman. Yeah, so let's get to chapter 1, The Breath of Cows, if we may, about the story of Mary and someone connecting with Mary.
Very good.
My hope really is, having you on in subsequent episodes, that we continue to flesh out this alternate story that he says
Absolutely.
It's not alternative if it is true.
Absolutely, and I think it helps. I think it helps when you hear context for like, where did this chapter come from?
Exactly.
What is this? So you read this thing, and here's a person who is quote unquote channeling Mary, asking Mary what it was like for you to give birth. And she's coming up with these storylines, which, of course, a jaded person could say, well, of course, what she's saying makes sense, and et cetera, et cetera. But I always say, look for the new information. Look for the stuff that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Or the stuff that you never thought about before, because it gives a different perspective to it. So in this case, I was at a wedding of some close friends back in Connecticut, and the minister, young woman, was very eloquent, very interesting, and I went up to speak to her after her to compliment her on her, what she had to say during the ceremony, and I noticed that she had a Tibetan tattoo on her arm. And then we started talking about Tibet. I'm one of those guys who goes, yeah, I've been to Tibet. Anyway, as we're talking, it turns out she's a shaman, and she's had this long background. And so we start to communicate. Email back and forth, how you doing, et cetera, et cetera. I tell her a little bit about the research back when this was some years ago, and she said, I have a friend who's a Michael Newton trained hypnotherapist, and I want to do that. I should do that. And so she does, and then she sends me the transcript of her session, and within that transcript of her conversation, I'm not around, somebody else filmed it or recorded it, she has an encounter with Mary. And so when she sends it to me, I then ask her, so have you encountered Mary before? I'm, that same mindset, like, is she wearing a name tag? How do you know it's her? And she said she had over the course of her life. And then I asked detailed questions about that. And it was, like, what does she look like? And so as she described it in different times in her life she had seen Mary as a different aged individual, not just the iconic, looking up, but also as an older woman, as a woman who had filled out. And so I just casually said, well, could we let's just do this is before I did what you and I did the last time I was on the show, well, a guided meditation. Before I had I didn't put her in a boat in a river, but I hadn't come to that yet. But I said, let's just see if Mary can come forward, we can have a conversation. So, and again, I try to challenge a little bit to see where the edges of the story are. Is this somebody who's repeating what religious authors have written in the past that I'm aware of, or is this new information? So I asked Mary a content question. So why is it that when you've appeared to people, let's say, throughout your recorded history, when Lourdes and different places, the context of what she says is always so very, very simple. It's not like a puzzle. It's not like you would think, you're seeing somebody from another realm. You would get like a, how do we fix climate? I don't know, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And she said, I always speak to people in the level I think they are capable of hearing. I'm speaking from pure place of love, and I try to repeat that message of unconditional love for everybody.
Yeah.
I thought, okay, well, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And so then I just asked Mickey, her name is Mickey Baloy, Baloy, and she's subsequently written a book about Mary since I started this project based on her conversations with her.
Great.
So I asked her, can you ask her what it was like to give birth? What was that about? And that's that chapter where she talks about not the mythology of, they're traveling and they get to in the inn, there's no inns and then they're in a barn. She just talks about being in this place, obviously, nowhere else to give birth, where there are animals. And she talks about the feeling of an animal's face when it comes over and breathes on you, and the warmth of that feeling. Not something you normally think about when you're thinking about Mary.
No.
And then she talks about the longing for her family members, for a woman, for girls in her family to be around. Of course, families were much different in those, they're all the same. But, there's much more active participation,
Right.
especially when something like this, birth going on, and there's also this element of fear that she talks about. The fear of knowing there's something about her child that's very important because it's been spoken to her, it's been talked about, and that brings this fear of, I'm bringing this child into this world. Is that going to be dangerous for my child?
Yeah.
And the most interesting thing to me was the speaking of these Persian priests. Now, they do get mentioned later on in the book. They're talking about the Magi, which were literally a group of priests from Persia, who were Zoroastrianism. Not from a Jewish tradition, not any other tradition, but Zoroaster predated, any kind of Judaism, and well, maybe that's arguable, but still, their religion is a long time ago. Parsis are now part of that group, and they live in India, and I know a few. But Zoroastrianism, this light and dark and prophecies, etc., they have brought gifts to Mary. But what's fascinating to me is the gifts were for Mary. Frankincense is a mild narcotic.
Yeah.
If you fill a room with frankincense, it's like you get a little bit stoned. It's a healing thing. It's used as a healing, sort of method.
Yeah.
Myrrh, which, think about this story-wise,
Yeah.
twice in his life he gets a lot of myrrh.
Yes, he does.
When he's born, and later on in the tomb, in a cave.
A little foreshadowing here. Yes.
Foreshadowing. I mean, storytelling wise. But myrrh, if you look it up, myrrh is a restorative. It stops bleeding. The baby's not bleeding. The gifts were from Mary.
Yeah.
You see? So the gold is for Joseph, or Joseph. The gold's for him. The restoratives are for Mary. You see?
Yeah.
So we've always had this kind of weird thing of like the gifts, they bring this. And now in the book, she mentions that it was weird that they brought these gifts. Because she's thinking, are these gifts for my child? You know, clearly they don't speak the same language. They bring these gifts.
Yeah.
But the gifts themselves are restoratives.
Right.
Which we find out later on get used again.
Well, let's even look at some of the storytelling and what we all come to think of when we think of Mary, the Virgin Mary.
That's a great term. I love it. And of course, that was one of the first questions I asked Jesus. So what's this thing about your mom being a virgin?
Yeah.
He laughed. So I asked him questions about, and you know, anybody who really takes the time to look this stuff up, they can look up there's a story that's been in the text. It's in Josephus, which is a Jewish historian who wrote about that era, and Jesus appears in his text, that Jesus' father was a Roman soldier. And as you find out in the book subsequently, that he was a very high up guy in the Roman hierarchy. He wasn't somebody who's just running around the streets of Jerusalem. That Mary was in his employment, was working at his home, and clearly that was the person who was his dad, of European descent, with, I was going to say, who knows what his eyes were? I haven't asked. But the idea of, I mean, this is what comes out of these interviews, asking, so who was your father? Was it this guy? His name is blanking right now, but there's a name. Joseph mentions his name, and then I've asked that name a couple.
I remember it. I don't remember it right off, but I remember that as well.
Right,
so this idea,
you can look it up.
Yeah.
But you know, it's that idea of they're not trying to deny that Jesus' father is God. They're just trying to say, like, this is who his father really is. And so now here's Mary, pregnant, with a soldier's child who is not going to marry her, or he's already married and he's already got a family, and
very wealthy, prominent.
Wealthy, prominent. She would have to take care of that on her own, or maybe he would have taken care of him. I don't know. But this guy who already has a family, whose wife is no longer in the picture, Joseph the carpenter, and the Bible mentions that Jesus had brothers and sisters. So he's already got a gaggle of kids. He needs a wife to watch over them. So he marries her. And it's just, marriage was a different contract than it is when it was
today, yeah.
But that being said, it's a wonderful, it doesn't take away anything from the magic of the story of him choosing his journey. The fact that he was a prophet, which is literally the word psychic.
Okay.
A prophet, somebody who sees into the future. And he hung out with prophets. He was in a scene. That's what people talk about. The Essene version of Judaism is very spiritual in terms of light and good and dark and et cetera, and it sort of incorporates how consciousness works. And from what these people say is that he was in a scene, and that that was his upbringing. And that at around the age of 12 or 13, just like in many countries, that's when you're assigned a wife. You're going to be married by this time. And one of his friends who that was going to happen with him said he was not about that. I'm not doing that. And that's why he left. So when the time came for him to marry, that's when he went out on the Silk Road. And then the question was for me, because I've been to the Silk Road, and I know how difficult it is to get from Jerusalem to, India, or into, to China. That's the road. But in those days, if you ever read the book Kim by Rudyard Kipling, it is a little bit like people would work for others to, have a place to stay or to have food. and you could travel back and forth, and apparently that's what he did. He traveled back and forth, and he was preaching what he was aware of from a very early age, the tables being turned over and stuff like that, talking about the kingdom of heaven being within you, consciousness, the afterlife, the flip side. He's talking about a world that he's aware of that has no hierarchy, no class system. And he's talking about it as if that's the reality. There is no color, no caste, which was an anathema in that area and that region, because everybody had this thing of the hierarchy of, the way you look, what your skin color was or is or whatever.
Yeah. So beautiful. So let me ask you, and I know I'm not going to be staying in fidelity with, the intro and the
I'm sorry. Wait, hold on. Time out. Yeah. So I didn't mean to dismiss the virgin question.
Oh, yeah. Go back to the Virgin Immaculate Conception. It felt like you did get there, but go ahead.
It is, but here's the weird part about the Virgin Mary. And I'm probably missing it up because I was a Catholic for a long time. And I have read the Bible, and I have looked at all this stuff. They're talking about Mary's mother. She gets visited by the angel, Mary's mother.
Oh.
She's the one. Mary is of virgin birth. It got convoluted.
Wait, I don't understand. You lost me there. Mary is of virgin birth. I don't know what that means.
Meaning she was the one who had no father, supposedly.
Well, it could mean she has no father, but it doesn't mean there wasn't.
No, her father's an angel.
The father's an angel. Okay. You have to spell it out for me, Rich.
Yeah. No, that's the... Jesus had... Okay, all right. Well, no, that's what they're saying. But anyway, I'm sorry. It's the visitation. So, forgive me.
It's okay.
I do get it mixed up. It's the visitation that Mary's mother has. Mary's mother has the visitation of an angel who says, your daughter's going to be give birth to this kid. But yes, the virgin birth seems clearly, and according to Jesus, was what people do when they want to manipulate text in the Bible to argue their point of view and to rule from their point of view. Well, that idea that birth is somehow a lesser state of being than being on a pedestal.
Right, and I think that's such a salient point, to manipulate the text and to be able to enforce their rule of law and all of that throughout the book. My
apologies to all those Virgin Mary people out there. See, I told you he's nuts. He is nuts.
You're just the messenger. This is just what the data
Well, it just shows
reveals.
you I'm not thinking this out in advance. Clearly.
Yeah.
I had to look it up. Oh, yeah, that's right.
There's so much information. And again, I listened to this a few months ago, so I'm like, I'm kind of forgetting this. But I'm actually kind of glad that I am, because it brings up a lot of curiosity. Like, what did they say? And what did this person say? So speaking of what did they say, I know at some point Jesus talked about having subsequent lives since that life, but remind me, did he have prior incarnations to being Jesus? And can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, like I say, so somebody says they're seeing Jesus.
Yep.
It could be through hypnotherapy, which is a 4 to 6 hour session. As I noted, I'm not doing the questions. The hypnotherapist does the questions. I'm filming. I might slip a note to the therapist to say, ask them this. So whatever comes through, comes through. In terms of the mediums who've seen him, and I've filmed a number who spontaneously, Kimberly Ray, other people, Jamie Butler. There's a wonderful interview with her and Jesus. It's fascinating. There's one online that people can look up. It's with channelingeric.com.
Yeah,
where
with Lisa Medhus.
With Lisa Medhus. And what's unusual about that is I saw the video and heard somebody speaking during the video, and then I reached out to her and said, are you aware that there's voices on your video? And then I slowed them down, I sped them up, and it's clearly somebody speaking, whispering about the content of what people are saying on camera. However, recorded at a different speed. In other words, like the frequency of their conversation was here, and the voices down here. I had to changed the voices so I could hear it normally.
Yeah.
Anyway, you can look that up online and actually hear those voices talking.
Jamie Butler with Lisa Meadows on Channeling
Lisa
Eric.
Meadows,
Yeah.
channelingeric.com. So that's another one. So mediums, hypnotherapy, and then meditation, where I'm having a conversation with somebody in a coffee shop, and I'm asking them to access some memory of their life. It might be a dream. In fact, one of them, very strong, was she had a dream and she thought she saw a ghost. And so while I'm accessing this memory of her 10 years old in London, she sees the ghost as Jesus. And then goes down this incredibly unusual path where not only do I ask him questions directly, and he says the same things he always says, but also it turns out that this person I'm talking to was a close friend of his and helped him and was standing between Mary and his mother at the crucifixion. And I did not know that there was a third person there. And here she says her name, and I swear she had no conscious awareness that there was a person by this name in the biblical text.
Yeah.
So when I looked it up, I was, mind blown to see that she
There's
not only existed,
historical accuracy.
but historically accurate.
Yeah,
very
I remember that
fine-bending.
part. I remember that part really well. So I can't believe it. Time is going by so quickly. So did he have lives, or incarnations prior to?
Thank
being
you.
Jesus, yeah.
Well, I can tell you that in those interviews that I've done with him one-on-one, I've asked him, have you incarnated in another time? In the Jamie Butler Jesus interview, he says 1964, he was born with as a brittle bone disease, and and Dr. Meadows knew what it was, being a doctor. She said osteogenesis imperfecta, and he was like, yeah, that.
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh, I'm so sorry, what a difficult life that must have been for you. And he said, no, actually, from my perspective, it was all love.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware that I was suffering, but everybody loved me. And the reason I was there as this person was to teach profound lessons in love. So without getting too deep into the weeds of, because the question is have you, every time that you've been on the planet, have you had something? And his answer is, well, yes, in a sense, because I'm bringing that same energy.
And lesson of love.
Of unconditional love, but the circumstances might be different. And so this idea that he's sent here by somebody to fix things, that's a human-centric way of looking at it.
Yeah.
He chooses to come at a particular place so he can help people.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he said. And of course, in the interview, I think in the Jamie Butler interview, he even says that he's here now as a woman.
In India, right?
Somewhere in India.
Yeah, I remember that. So given we're going to have more conversations, and given that we're very, very close to the end of our time, if you were going to share, just for today, some of what he wants humanity to know or remember or connect to more, what are those messages?
Well, what a wonderful idea for a question. First and foremost, it's to realize that nobody dies. That we leave the stage. We bring a portion of our conscious energy to the stage. We wear props and we have costumes and we act things out, but based on the data and research, once the curtain falls, we go home. Very important to realize we didn't come alone and we don't leave alone. We have people who helped us get here, and we have people we volunteered to help while we're here, and they're all there to greet us and applaud. So, and that's important to realize that we can access those we love if we want to, including him.
Including him.
And so if somebody wants to have a conversation with him, and this is what people will argue with me, yes, you can imagine, on Quora I have a forum called Hacking the Afterlife. People just want to say I'm nuts. It's fine. It's fine. But I always say, look, you have a question for him? Ask him.
Yeah.
He says consistently, he's more than happy to stop by and help. He can't change the path you've chosen. He can't alter reality. He can't manipulate reality. But
Or
he can
won't.
give you... Sorry?
I said, or he won't.
Or he won't, but he can give you insight, and he can give you the feeling of unconditional love.
Yes.
And he can change the paradigm, because once you realize you can talk to him, then you realize, oh, I can talk to anybody. My mom, my dad, my grandparents.
So,
I can learn things from them, and this will help me in my journey.
In my journey. And so, Rich, have you ever endeavored to have a conversation with him one-on-one without someone bridging that gap?
Well, what's funny is that listen, I don't know how else to put it, but he shows up so often.
You don't need to?
He
like,
he
enough
answers,
already.
Well, no, he answers my questions in a very funny way. He'll even say, Richard, the answer has not changed. You've asked this question before. You know the answer.
Yeah.
And the idea is, and I have had some awareness of some dreams where I've had conversations with him, continuing. And it's more of a conversation, which is, well, what about this? And what about that? And what about this? So my thing is, it's not about me accessing him, really. And I'm sure, he's always around. He's a hilarious guy. What can I say? He makes me laugh. I sometimes make him laugh.
That doesn't surprise me. Well, as always, this goes by so quickly. Thank you again. Anyone interested, and I can't imagine that you wouldn't be, it is such a good, I say read, I listened, because I love to listen to it as I'm doing other things. The Greatest Story Never Told, as told by Jesus and Those Who Knew Him, by Richard Martini. Grab a copy. It's riveting.
I so appreciate us doing this, because as I mentioned before, it's very uncomfortable for me to go out and try to sell it as a book. I'm sharing it as a book. Yeah. It costs money to print it, but I want people to send it back, get a refund if they're offended by it in any stretch of the imagination. Somebody gives it to you, return it. If it's bothersome. But if you need help from him, let's say, or from accessing ideas about unconditional love, he's a really good resource.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's incredibly controversial. And at the same time, when you really boil it down, it's a book about love.
Unconditional love. And it's, it's easy for me to say that, love without condition. I'll just really quickly, there was a conversation we had with somebody, a jaded skeptic, in It's a Wonderful Afterlife. The question was, what or who is God? And a guide came through and said, God is beyond the capacity of the human brain to comprehend. Is too hard. However, you can experience God by opening your heart to everyone and all things.
Yes.
Now that is consistently repeated by Jesus. Opening your heart to everyone and all things, meaning everything has a right to exist.
Yes.
So allow that there's a reason for it to be here, and allow it to exist, and try to love yourself. Key, that's the first. And then allow yourself to love other people.
Mm-hmm. Sounds pretty right on to me. Yeah. So wonderful. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you so much, Kristin. I appreciate it. You're very kind.
How I Made It Through is produced and distributed by EIQ Media, LLC. Elevate your emotional IQ with podcasts and content focused on overcoming adversity, leadership, mental health, entrepreneurship, spiritually transformative experiences, and more.